Thank you, Mark, and thank you all for being here today. Pensions and unfunded liabilities is not the most exciting issue, especially after lunch. So we're going to try and keep the pace moving quickly and keep you interested. Get ready to ask your questions. The members of the panel, it really is a remarkable group for this very important issue in California. On my far right is Joe Nation, who is at Stanford University and probably knows the math of pensions and retiree healthcare better than anybody else in California. Next to him is Judy Lin, who's a reporter with CalMatters, which is a nonprofit that is now the largest I think you have the largest staff now of any press organization in Sacramento. Full disclosure, I'm a supporter of CalMatters. Judy is a reporter for them and has drilled down more on the pension issue than virtually any reporter in California. Eric Filseth is going to become better known in California soon. He's a member of the Palo Alto City Council. He's vice mayor there and has led an effort to do something which is remarkable in the pension world, which we will get to. Mayor Sam Liccardo of San Jose needs no introduction to all of you. His city has been at the forefront of a number of these issues, and he will talk about the steps that he's taking there and what he's gone through. And I'm David Crane. I'm a member of this. I teach here at Stanford, and I run an organization called Govern for California, which is a political organization. So with that, Joe Nation, tell us the math.
Welcome, everyone. This is, as David said, it's not the most exciting topic. But since the governor talked about annihilation, maybe it's the appropriate follow-on. I want to talk about, in particular, the impact of increased pension spending in the past and in the future on other government services. And I always like to start off with this quote because I like to remind people that this is just math. And so the quote is, it's not even a matter of higher math, it's fifth grade arithmetic. It's not fifth grade, it's probably ninth grade algebra. But the person who said that just left the room. That was Governor Brown back in 2011. And he said that when he was attempting to move the legislature in the right direction towards pension reform. They did a little bit back in 2012, and I think he would even say that he certainly wishes that they'd been able to do more. I want to point to a website that we run called pensiontracker.org. We just updated the 2016 data today. I know you're saying 2016, wait a minute, it's almost 2019. We actually get some of our data from CalPERS, and last year we found a number of errors, of anomalies in that data. We finally cleaned it up and we just posted it today. So if you want to go to pensiontracker.org, you can actually drill down and look at local agencies. So you could go to the city of San Jose, city of Palo Alto, the Las Galinas Valley Sanitation District, and you can see what their pension obligations are on a per capita, per household, et cetera basis. So first I want to highlight the fact that this is a problem that's gotten much worse over time. If you look at the unfunded liability, and this is just for CalPERS, if you're not familiar with CalPERS, the largest pension system in the country and certainly in California. And back in the late 90s, about 2000, they reported that they had a surplus. And about that time, they actually expanded benefits greatly, initially at the state level, and then it eventually transferred to the local level. And you can see that in 2002 and 3, ended up with about, 30 or so billion dollars in the red. And if you go out to 2016, the last year we have data available, you're about $150 billion in the red. So $150 billion unfunded liability for CalPERS alone. And again, there's CalPERS, which represents most state and local employees, CalSTRS, which is for most school teachers, the UC system, fairly small, and then there are a lot of independent systems like San Jose that run their own. And if you actually, the graph I just showed you is what CalPERS would say its unfunded liability is. They would say today it's about $150 billion. But if you actually do the math slightly differently, specifically if you discount liabilities going forward at a different rate, and virtually, well, in fact, I'm not going to say virtually every economist. Every financial economist I've ever talked to has said that this is a better way to look at this. Then that number for CalPERS ends up being more than $600 billion. And if you add CalPERS, CalSTRS, independents, and UCs, this ends up being about $1 trillion. $1 trillion for the state. And so you're probably asking yourself, well, is that a lot of money? State's general fund this year is about $130 billion. So the unfunded obligation of over $1 trillion and the general fund is about $130 billion. So roughly 8 times the size. This is a report that I issued, a working paper from last year, and it looked at past pension spending projected out to the future, did 14 case studies, the state of California, counties, cities, special districts, schools, districts, and looked at pension costs going back and then projected pension costs going forward, so built models in these 14 different cases. And I looked at the budgets to see what sort of crowd out had occurred in the past and what I thought was likely to occur in the future. This is just an example of the employer contributions and how they changed from 2002 and 3. The reason we chose that year is because that's as far back as I could get data. I couldn't get it before that. But 2002 and 3 up to 2017 and 18. And the average increase was 400%. So over the last 16 or so years, every agency, every public agency, whether you're a city, a county, a special district, a school district, the state, you've seen a pretty sharp and dramatic increase in the amount that you're putting into pensions. If you look to say, well, what does it look like in the next, out to the year 2030, we forecast out to that. This shows the contributions that are required 2008-9, then roughly today, 2017-18. And you see a baseline case, an alternative case. The blue is the baseline. The sort of orange is the alternative. That's the rate. The baseline case is if things go according to plan. So if things go according to plan, it's still pretty painful for every agency out there. If they don't go according to plan, the alternative case reflects a scenario where the rate of return is 2% less than forecast or planned for. And for the most part, systems use 7 to 7.5% today. Most people think that's probably too optimistic. The CalSTRS contribution rate, I really want to hit on school districts because school districts are having a very tough time right now. Their contribution rate at the local level is going to double over a very short period of time. And you can see that it's more or less going to plateau at about 18%. They used to be at 8% of payroll. So they paid 8% of payroll. Now they're going to pay about 18%. At the state level, it's even worse. The state contributions are probably going to triple. And if they underperform, the state picks up most of the tab, not the local districts. But it'll be more painful at the district level. What sort of cuts in services did we see in the past and what are likely to happen in the future? At the state level, it's social services and higher education. Social services are things like services to the elderly, blind, et cetera. They're at the bottom. Counties, it's public assistance welfare. Cities, mostly soft services, libraries and museums and so forth, but also public safety crowd out. I think you'll hear that from Eric Filseth. School districts, cuts in employees across the board that we're seeing there as well. Who pays? A lot of people say it's going to be taxpayers who pay. Well, taxpayers will pay because there will be some additional funds that will be raised in some places. But I want to focus on the folks who are really going to be hurt, and I think it's poor people because the crowd out's going to continue. And the other crowd out we're going to see the pain we're going to see is in employees and retirees in the public sector. And state and school employees are generally insulated from that. State can't declare bankruptcy. Those state employees are probably pretty safe. If I were a local employee, if I were a gardener in the city of X out there, I'd be worried about my city being able to make those contributions and to pay me the pension that I was guaranteed. And so a couple of examples here. I won't go into detail there. Hopefully we can get to a point at one of the discussion where we talk about how cities can respond, and you've got a mayor and a city council member who can tell you exactly how they are responding so far. Thank you.
Well, why don't I tell you about CalMatters?
Yep, do that.
Okay.
Be a salesperson. Go on.
So I've been a capital reporter for more than 15 years, but mostly with the Sacramento Bee and Associated Press. And then there was this new venture called CalMatters, and it was launching. Nobody knew what it was. It was very much a startup. The idea was to tell Californians about their government, how it works, and their policies, and their the politics happening, and in a way that was more accessible. And that's definitely one of our goals, to get out of the newspaper box and share with you information, things that are happening in Sacramento in a new way, in interactive way, in a fun way, in a more understandable way. And so when we're one of the things we would do to start branding our identity is to partner with newspaper existing. It's kind of ironic, we're competing newspapers, but we still work with them. Is partnering with newspapers and outlets. And so we did a series of stories with the LA Times and Capital Public Radio looking at this public pension problem. And it was a whole series, and it involved both print and online and radio. So you're getting the short version of a year's worth of work. So we went back, and you can go back to a lot of different points in history of when this started, but the big one we wanted to tell was 1999, when Governor Gray Davis was in office. He and the legislature signed off on a package of benefit increases for state workers, and the pitch was that it wouldn't cost us anything as taxpayers. The idea is that the stock market, you remember the pets.com era, people were making money hand over fist, and it was just the state workers, public workers weren't getting any of this. So they wanted a share of it, and they negotiated this bill through and pushed it through, and it had lucrative retroactive benefits for current and past employees. And then what happens? The first .com crashes, and then we had the Great Recession. So you can see, had the money kept flowing, we would be fine. But life doesn't work out that way, as everything that from Jerry Brown told you. And so now we are way short. And there are obviously other factors, but that's the highlights. So what are we looking at now? There's this disconnect between what we've promised to workers and what we're able to pay for. So if you look at today's, the average CHP officer, and I'm just going to use them just to kind of give you a sense of your typical state worker. Their average salary was $111,000. They're retiring with roughly 90% of their salary. And this last point, I think, is most staggering. And as an employee, you do put in for your pensions. Of course, labor is going to say hey, we pay for our pensions, we earn this. And sure, they do. They put in about roughly 11%. The state has to chip in 55% of every dollar that they make. I don't know about you, but I don't know what private employer will match 50% of your salary just to cover your pension and the benefits you get in retirement. So that to me is just a real jaw-dropping figure for like how much this is costing. And do they know this? Absolutely. John Hamm, who is famous for being the father of 3% at 50, it's this rule of thumb where you get 3% of your salary for each year worked, and you get to retire at 50. Today, he was the one who negotiated that for the highway patrol officers, and he acknowledges, there is pension envy, and it is a problem because your average person out there isn't getting this kind of benefit. So the governor, of course, he he comes in at a time when the recession is, where everything's trending downward. He has to come in and straighten out the California's fiscal house. And one of the first thing he does is saying, hey, we need to, he goes to the lawmakers and labor and says, hey, we need you to chip in. And he does his best. He passes a package known as PEPRA. It's the Public Pension Employee Reform Act of 2812. And he gets a lot of good stuff, this pension spiking stuff that are tactics that are used by some members to inflate their last year of pay to make it look like they should deserve so much more in retirement than they actually, than their typical working years. But he didn't get two key things. And the number-wise, he didn't get the hybrid system. He pushed for new employees to go under a three-legged stool model. It was a Social Security, 401k, and pensions. And he said, look, the three of them put together, it still provides you with a very comfortable and safe retirement. It's not going to make you rich, but it will get you through a comfortable life. I'm going to hustle. I'm getting the 2-minute warning. Is that okay? And so I wanted to say that he gets a second governor's portrait on his way out, and so I feel like when I think about what he should have for his second portrait, I think of him as like a white knight with the armor on the steed, trying to like fight this fight, and even though he fought the good fight, it's kind of a mixed result. And then that takes you to Joe mentioned the teachers. Something that you'll be noticing, and not only in the crowd out effect, is an impact on schools. If you look at all the budgets, we've been gaining so much for schools, and yet you still hear, I know in Sacramento, I still hear there's a deficit for schools. Why is there a deficit for schools when like the taxes are up, the budgets are up? Where's more money? Where is it going? Well, the legislative analysts had done this, and they said nearly 40% of all new revenue is going straight to pensions. This is just the cost of promises that we've made. And we did our own number crunching. If you were to wrap your hands around all the public pensions out there at the state and local government level, we're looking at $400 billion, and this is for pensions and retiree health care. You can look through and break it down further by CalPERSTers, but the numbers are staggering. It's 3 times the state budget. That means 3 years of paying for colleges and prisons and fighting fighting the wildfire season, everything like that. And in raw numbers, that's $25 billion that's just going straight to pensions. So a little bit of what's next. There's a court fight. We didn't get to this. I wish Jerry would have talked about it, about the California rule. There's a definition that a public employee who goes into work on the first day is entitled to all the benefits that they're promised that first day for perpetuity. That's really generous. And right now, there's no way to make changes. And so this crop of current employees are going to have all the benefits that they've earned and in the future. That gives government very little flexibility to find savings. And so this is what Jerry Brown is trying to fight. And there are two, right now, appeals courts are coming out with different decisions, but the state Supreme Court has agreed to hear it. They haven't heard it though. At the beginning of the year when they were saying they were gonna listen to it, I was pregnant. I had my baby, I'm still waiting. So Governor Brown also has a appointment to make on this panel. So it would be very interesting to watch who he appoints. Now, as to the next governor, what does he think? When we asked Newsom during an interview about what he thinks about the California rule, he kind of brushed it off. He was very much like, well, they'll decide what they'll decide. To him, it's an issue that's to be negotiated at the bargaining table with unions. You can say that that's a naive point of view or ineffective. We don't know. We'll have to see. And so there you go. That's my presentation.
Eric is now going to talk to us about an esoteric approach being taken by Palo Alto, which will be very interesting to an economic crowd.
Thank you.
That's a good setup for you.
Yeah, no, the governor used the word soporific about an hour ago, and this is a topic that is soporific most of the time. What I want to talk about is sort of some of our experiences in the city of Palo Alto next door here. And the quick summary is that we did a reform last year wherein we recalculated our pension finances at realistic investment return rates. We used 6.2%. We focused on the income statement and operating expenses as opposed to the debt, because the way you get to a very large unfunded liability is through a recurring sequence of small operating expense gaps compounded over many years. So we focused on there, and we have gone back and are in the process of attempting to cut operating expenses accordingly and save the difference in the Section 115 trust. And the real hard task ahead is to develop a plan to amortize the existing debt, but at least if we execute points 1 through 3, we'll stop growing the debt. So with that, let me talk for a second about the rest of this. Where we are and how did we get here? What does the future look like if we do nothing? And what we want to do about it. So in the city of Palo Alto, it happened, we have I guess as of yesterday, the 8th largest pension liability per household in the state of California. There's a number of reasons for that. One is that we run our own utilities, so we have a lot more employees than normal size. If you look at our total liability, the unfunded pension liability as of 2 years ago, because CalPERS calculates 2 years in arrears, was a little over $509 million, valued at 6.2% as the asset return rate. Add a couple of years of growth at 7% because the unfunded liability grows at the assumed discount rate every year you don't pay it off, plus $150 million in unfunded medical liabilities, so our total UAL is somewhere between $700 and $750 million at this point. But if you look at just the pension part, we pay 8% of the general fund on just the amortization payment on the existing $500 million debt, which is about $17 million a year for us because our general fund this year is $210 million. And it's growing at 17% per year. It's the fastest growing major city expense we have. Okay? That's just the amortization payment, not including the normal cost. So it crowds out a variety of kinds of spending. So here in Palo Alto, this is what our general fund has looked like since the beginning of the millennium. And you can see that it almost looks like one line. We have, revenue and expenses match, which either means that we are incredibly well managed financially, or else that we find a way to spend every dollar we take in. And the reality is probably a combination of both those things. And I think most agencies in the state probably manage pretty close to this way too. And I think, and that is actually part of the problem. So you say, okay, so then if we balance our budget every year, where does all this debt come from? Okay, because it's not like we're out borrowing money right and left. And yet, if you look at the beginning of the millennium, we were at break even or surplus. We had no debt, and here it is 17 years later, and we have $500 million in debt. And so the answer must be that, in fact, our expenses, there must be some expenses that we don't have, that we don't record, right? And those must be contributing to this. And, oh, by the way, that's a glance at what our headcount in the general fund has looked like in the intervening time. And by the way, the place this started was September 19th, 2001. We adopted 3% 50 for the Police Officers Association. We subsequently adopted it for the other bargaining groups. And that's when this began because we didn't save any more money once we did that. Okay, so we got interested in where could there be an expense that we don't know about. And so we gravitated pretty quickly to the estimated asset returns from CalPERS, which at the time were 7.5% or something like that. And so we commissioned an independent actuarial analysis at 6.2%, which is the Wilshire Associates number. And we focused both on UAL and annual payroll cost. And what we found was that there's an operating expense. I mean, the discount rate affects not only the debt, but also your operating expenses. And it affects the normal cost, which is the cost of this year's pensions. And if you're making amortization payments, it affects those as well. Okay, and what we found was that from an ROI of 7% to 6.2%, we underestimated our operating expenses in the general fund by 2 to 3%. Okay, and if you went from 7.375% to 6.2%, because under the 3-year phase-in, CalPERS it's 7.375%, then understates general fund expenses by 4 to 6% in Palo Alto. And if you went from 8% to 6.2%, which is where CalPERS was for most of the millennium, then you underestimate general fund expenses by maybe 8% or something like that. And so this is not terribly definitive, but if you took an example and said, well, if your general fund's going to grow at 4.5% or so, and you've got a discount rate at 8%, and you're underestimating your expenses by maybe 8%, how long does it take to build an unfunded liability that's equal in size to the general fund? And the answer is, 10 to 12 years. And after 15 years, your UAL is 150% of the general fund, which is pretty much where we are at this point at Palo Alto. And the point is that where does all this debt come from? Large unfunded liabilities can be built by recurring small operating expense gaps compounded over many years. So this is our general fund today. About $210 million. We spend about 2/3 of it on wages and benefits. That's the blue. And the red piece that I have broken out is also accounted for under wages and benefits in most cities. And the remainder is split, sort of, not too close to evenly, but pretty much split between sort of other expenses, pencils and papers and leases and things like that, versus transfer to capital equipment budgets, or capital investment budgets. So the piece that we're really interested in, there are 2 operating expense components to pension costs. One is the normal cost, and the other is the payment on the unfunded liability, okay, which is that $17 million number for us this year. Okay, and we're really interested in this one because they actually behave very differently. Okay, normal cost, grows commensurately with wages and benefits, and if you increase staff or reduce staff, then the normal cost increases or reduces accordingly. But the unfunded liability payment is based on the estimated size of your unfunded liability, which is a function of your estimated asset returns, and the amortization schedule, which means that there's not any way for us to affect it in the short term. We can affect it in the long term, but not the short term. So we got very interested in that cost. Okay. What else am I going to say about that? Oh, the other piece that I would comment on is because we underestimate the normal cost, okay, because of the overestimate of asset returns, there is a piece of normal cost that doesn't appear anywhere in our financial statements, okay, which is at this level it's a few $1 million, right? This is the piece that compounds every year to increase the unfunded liability. So there's actually a debate going on in Palo Alto right now that this ought to be accrued explicitly as a liability in our financial reports. And there's some debate over that right now going on. So this is where we are now. So what does it look like going forward? Okay. Well, again, this is just the amortization payment we're looking at here, but it has grown pretty quickly over the last several years. Okay, and this year it's going to grow 17%, and it accounts for just under 8% of the general fund. And we said, okay, what if it keeps growing this fast? Now, 17% is a pretty quick growth rate. On the other hand, if it does keep growing that, and this is not assuming a recession or anything like that, then in 5 years it should be 14% of the general fund, and in 10 years it'll be almost a quarter of the general fund, assuming 4 or 5% growth rate in our general fund. Okay, And you say, well, 17%. I mean, every year that I'm the city council, we get a new estimate that says, yeah, it grew fast. The amortization payment grew a lot last year, but in 2 years it's going to drop. Okay? So here are some arguments why it may not drop. Okay? Why this actually could be realistic. Okay? First of all, assuming that the true realistic asset return is 6.2% or thereabouts, not 7%, then it's inevitable that CalPERS is going to continue to reduce their discount rate below 7%. And as that happens, the total liability is going to increase, or the estimated. Second, we haven't even looked at wage growth, okay? So we assume 3% a year wage growth, but the reality is probably 1% or so higher than that, okay? We haven't incorporated that. That will drive up the liability as well. And finally, if we don't close the operating expense gap every year, then we're going to continue to increase the real liability, so the debt's going to get bigger and bigger. If you put all those things together, you could make a case that actually we could be seeing, these kinds of growth rates in just the amortization payment, for some time to come. Now, you don't see that completely in financial statements because our financial statements tend to lump this together with the normal cost. The normal cost doesn't grow nearly as fast. Okay. So what are the impacts?
To the point about how you're now accruing 6.2%. There'll be plenty of time for discussion.
Yeah, so real briefly, I think this is not news. As other cities, we are, some of our most expensive staff is public safety, and that's declined over time. We are outsourcing things. We are replacing people with technology. We've dropped some, we're working on work rules. We have not done a lot of revenue increases so forth, but that may be in our future. How do we get out of this? The first job one is to stop adding debt, and so that's why we did what we did. We used 6.2% ROI. We did an actuarial analysis with our regular consultants, but we're also deploying the software GovInvest because we want to be able to do what-if analysis on the fly for these kinds of things. We directed the city manager to find structural cuts for half the gap this year, and we're going to try to find the other half next year. Expectation is we'll use the Section 115 trust for the savings, and then we're going to need to have a plan to develop to amortize the existing debt. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. So as the mayor hobbles up there, I didn't realize you were injured. So what's going on in Palo Alto is it's no different than any other place in California, and this is a very important point to make. It's not just the size of the promise, like 3% at 50, et cetera. It's the underfunding, and it's the big lie about how much they're going to earn on the investment. But Palo Alto is the one place in the state that is accruing at a reasonable rate, or at least partly at a reasonable rate. Trying to, yeah. Mayor Liccardo.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to talk about our journey in the city of San Jose, that small town to the south of you. And I say a journey because pension reform is never that one moment of epiphany where everyone, council, community, all hold hands together and say, let's fix this. This is an uneven process, and it certainly has been in the city of San Jose, and I think Judy described, there are mixed results. That is absolutely true in our case as well. But there was no one defining moment. There were many, and this chart probably describes the journey best, at least mathematically, about where we started and where we're now today. It started, of course, back in the beginning of the century when, as you have heard several times, there were many generous changes made to pension formulas. We started out at a time when we were paying between $50 and $60 million a year for pension, retiree health care, and other retirement obligations. That number quadrupled in a period of about a dozen years. As you can imagine, it quadrupled precisely through 2 recessions, which might have a pretty deleterious impact on folks trying to balance a budget. That's pretty much where we begin our journey. Because it was around that time in 2007 when Mayor Chuck Reed came into office, and I also came into office as a council member, and supporting his efforts to try to rein in retirement costs. This was the picture in June of 2011, a few years in. What you see in the blue chart is almost $3 billion of unfunded liabilities. What's really important about this is that we recognize this is not just about pensions, but about retiree health care, because I know that story is often missed in the media, not by CalMatters, of course, but by others, because retiree health care is absolutely a driving force of these costs. In our case, it was about half the unfunded liability, and we needed to fix both if we were going to try to have any forward progress. This almost $3 billion, by the way, was not even trued up to realistic assumptions, either demographically or, as you've probably heard about, the discount rate. This is back in the days when discount rate was between 8.0 and 8.25% for our two pension funds. So that number obviously would grow as you start to alter the assumptions to economic reality. So as we move through the perfect storm of rising pension costs, rising retiree health care costs, and of course the Great Recession, we had a very painful moment in San Jose's history. We lost about a third of our workforce, 1/3. We today still have the most thinly staffed city hall of any major city in the country. And that is after several years of recovery. So this was a painful time. One of the worst votes I ever took, if not the very worst, was the vote to lay off more than 250 employees in 2010, including 66 cops. And I'll get back to the police in just a moment because they're pretty important in this whole story. So negotiations commenced in roughly 2011, and through what was 11 months of negotiation with 11 bargaining units in the city of San Jose. As you can imagine, not an easy feat. We ultimately reached impasse, went to the ballot in 2012. It was called Measure B. Measure B was strongly supported by the electorate. More than 70% of the voters supported it. This was a series of reforms that would essentially reduce the benefit of pensions going forward, in addition to some other reforms, which I won't go into great detail, but for the most part, the healthcare savings were found by reducing the plan to essentially the lowest cost formula and defining that into the formula. And there's this one other element I just want to describe briefly because this is something that's vexed a lot of cities and counties. There was a supplemental benefit. It's independent of the pension and the retiree health care piece. It's called in the city of San Jose, it was called the supplemental retirement benefit, and what in many cities they call the 13th check. And this is what existed a couple decades ago, where if your pension plan was earning pretty nice returns, if you're getting above your 8% discount rate in a good year, then you would cut a check to your employees and retirees, actually to the retirees, to give them back the additional dollars you got. And of course, you can probably see the challenge in that because inevitably you're going to have substandard years in which you're going to really need that money to fill the gap, and of course you're not going to have it. So part of the pension reform that Chuck Reed led was to eliminate that 13th check, the supplemental retirement benefit. Other cities like San Francisco also had a similar benefit, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So I came into office in 2015, having gone through an election in 2014. In the period of time since pension reform passed in 2012 and I came into office, we had a series of challenges. First, we had court decisions and per board decisions, which ultimately pushed us backward in terms of our ability to implement many of these reforms, including finding that we did not comply with negotiation standards under a court decision called Seal Beach. So we had to go back and negotiate again. And it was also the case that we were still bleeding employees, though for slightly different reasons. We had just enacted pay cuts. We had seen many employees leave the city for other cities. And of course, with pension reform as well, it's fair to say that there was a pretty toxic brew that created an enormous amount of animosity between the employee groups and management, and we were struggling mightily just to keep employees on board. The campaign for mayor in 2014, it's fair to say that this issue was prominent. This was the defining issue in the campaign. How we were going to grapple with a police force that had lost more than 500 officers. We were down to, at one point during my tenure, a few more than 800 officers to patrol a city of more than 1 million people. To give you a sense of context, San Francisco has about 2,200 officers for a smaller population. So that's not a lot of officers, and that obviously creates lots of concerns. So I came into office trying to figure out how we were going to try to pull it all together. Ultimately, and I realize we're running short on time, so I'll just get to the point. We went back to the bargaining table and negotiated a new plan, set of plans. What was really critical in all of this was one of the unions, the police union, hired an actuary that pretty much told them what our actuaries were telling us. And that was a really critical, pivotal moment when everybody agreed on the math. Because when we agreed on the math, we actually understood that, first of all, we were all in the same problem, the same mess. The problem wasn't one side or the other. The problem was the math. Secondly, the retiree health care benefit, ultimately the unions concluded, wasn't just too expensive for our taxpayers, it was too expensive for them too. And they ultimately decided we need to give up on this retiree health care benefit because it's costing us too much money. So that was really critical for us to be able to get through a negotiation that ultimately enabled us to save as much money, in fact, slightly more money than we got through the original reform. We essentially halted a retiree health care plan for new hires and eliminated the defined benefit for retiree health care. On the pension side, we reduced the pension to something that was slightly less costly than the PEPRA formula that was earlier referred to, that the governor led statewide. We were able to find a slightly less costly version of that. I'm happy to describe that in any detail if anyone has questions. And then we had to try to eliminate the supplemental retirement benefit, this 13th check, which was costing us about $13 million a year. And the challenge we had was that when San Francisco tried doing the same thing, the Court of Appeals up in San Francisco said they could not eliminate it without giving employees some kind of commensurate benefit. This is the California rule you've heard something about. And so, fortunately, with a lot of work with our partners on the other side of the bargaining table, we did come up with a benefit. It was certainly not commensurate in terms of the aggregate value of cost. What was costing us $13 million, we were ultimately able to trade in for a benefit that cost us just a few $100,000 that protected less than 50 retirees from the impacts of inflation if they had retired at a period when inflation was really starting to eat away significantly at their pension benefit. And so we essentially made this trade with everyone understanding this was the only way essentially we were going to get through this and still be able to save the dollars to keep everything afloat. The result are these two lines you see here, approximately $3 billion in savings over 30 years. And where we started, as you see on the x-axis all the way at the bottom is 15-16 when this was ultimately implemented. We had to go to the voters and get approval and what we call Measure F. And that gap is essentially the savings between the two lines. Cumulatively, that was $3 billion in savings. Now, that's not the end of the story because you'd say, well, this is a happy ending, right? We fixed it, didn't we? Well, the challenge is we also need to reduce our discount rates. And you've probably heard as you reduce discount rates, you got to pay more into the fund, certainly in the short term. And that costs money. And then sometimes your funds don't return very well, and that costs money too. So we get finally to this chart, and I'll just point out the key moments in this journey. This is 2012 when we enacted pension reform the first time, and you can see the cost of the general fund dropped for a short period. That was positive for our general fund, certainly. Then you saw rising costs again as we were starting to ratchet down the discount rate, which was driving up costs. We passed pension reform again. Again, we have a slight stall in the increase in costs, but then nearly $50 million increase here in 2017. Again, discount rates are dropping, so we have to contribute more. We're now at 6.75 in one fund and 6.875 in the other. Not quite at 6.2, but hopefully we'll be getting there eventually. And poor returns. That year we lost a lot of money in our investments. And so this is a very uneven picture, ultimately. And if there's any happy ending in any of this, it comes way out here 4 or 5 years from now when we can say for the first time in my political lifetime, we may actually see a drop in retirement costs in our city. But we know that's after we've exceeded $350 million in annual contributions in a city with a general fund budget of about $1.1 billion. That's a very big chunk of our general fund. And so there is no simple answer to any of this, but I guess I wanted to present our journey as an example of what pension reform looks like. And there are going to be more points along the way. But ultimately, the goal is seeing how we can bend this curve so we can start to restore services meaningfully in cities throughout the country. Thank you.
Thank you. So let me start with two questions, and actually start first with Mayor Liccardo. Most people are not that familiar with the retiree healthcare issue, which is actually a massive issue in California. The state of California's liability for retiree healthcare, which is otherwise known as other post-employment benefits, or OPEB, as of last year was $91 billion. So it'll be over $100 billion this year. That's more than the state's liability for pensions. In the Los Angeles Unified School District, which has 600,000 kids, it's the largest school district in the state, second largest school district in the country, they have a retiree healthcare liability of $15 billion. It's like the fifth largest in the country, I think. It's more than twice as much their pension liability. So to make sure everybody understands what retiree healthcare is, essentially, it is for those retirees who are over 65, who are eligible for Medicare. For those retirees, it is school districts and local governments and the state subsidizing health insurance for people who are already entitled to Medicare. If they're retired before they're 65, it is local governments, the state and school districts, subsidizing the health insurance, and these are platinum plans, for people that are entitled to Obamacare subsidies, which go up to 400% of the poverty level. So for example, this year in LAUSD, which is already basically insolvent, that district is spending $300 million this year. They're transferring $300 million this year, essentially from active teachers. They have 30,000 active teachers. That translates into a $10,000 a year raise for those teachers. They're taking $300 million and they're using it to subsidize retirees on Medicare or eligible for Obamacare subsidies. Now, to how many of you does that make sense? To how many, to anybody with any business or any government or anything, what sense does it make to transfer money from people who are in desperate need of salary increases to subsidize people like me when I go on Medicare at the end of this year? Well, LA is doing that. I did not know that you had done a reform which applies to new employees. Yeah. And now the question for you is, do you think San Jose is going to get to the point where they'll do what the city of Glendale did? Glendale, in Southern California, got rid of retiree healthcare for all their employees. And they only reached that conclusion after Obamacare went into effect, and it's a very liberal council down there. They reached the conclusion they could do it, as much as it pained them to do it, because the employees could get their subsidies from Medicare and Obamacare. Do you think there's a world, I mean, what's your liability still $1.5 billion?
No, actually, the liability has increased because of our reduction in our discount rate.
Right.
And yeah, for all the reasons we described. So, yeah, there's no question that this is something that's not being discussed enough as we talk about the pension challenge. We closed the plan essentially going forward. I was under the understanding that there were legal requirements preventing us, California law, from actually doing anything with current employees. So that's why we have not ventured there. But certainly I'm open to looking at other
It's
options.
contractual. I mean, yeah. Well, that's what Glendale did. It's not like the pension situation. And I realize how tough it would be, yeah. So I'm not suggesting you do it, but I just want to, everybody focuses on pensions. Retiree healthcare is much lower hanging fruit, if you will. It's not protected by the California rule. It's contractual, but it's usually subject to bargaining. Yeah. It's really linking retiree healthcare to active healthcare. The state of California, our state, the one that earlier today people were saying 150,000 of us pay 50% of all the personal income taxes to, our state could get rid of that $91 billion liability in about a year. It just takes political nerve. I have a question for Joe now, which is about the increasing schism between local employees and special districts and state employees at CalPERS. And the issue there for everybody is, as Joe mentioned before, the state cannot declare bankruptcy, and school districts under the, I think it's the Butt decision, are required to be bailed out by the state, so they cannot declare bankruptcy. So employees have much less to worry about in the event of a default by the state. The state's not going to default. Mm-hmm. It's also very senior in the waterfall in terms of coverage. But local governments can go broke, and employees can lose their benefits. which means local employees have a much greater interest in proper pre-funding of their plans using a truthful discount rate. They are much more at risk to the lie that Eric was talking about, using a super high discount rate to finance, whereas a state prison guard is going to get their pension payment come hell or high water, whether it's funded or not, because the state can't declare bankruptcy and has the power to tax. Is a schism developing at CalPERS between local employees and state employees over the discount rate issue for that reason?
So certainly my experience the last year or two has been that that's absolutely occurring. And I think it's because employees at the local level are beginning to understand that they are at risk. Again, if a state employee has very little risk, a school district employee has a very low risk because of what David's described. But I will tell you that, say, 2 years ago, people at the local government level in cities and counties and special districts across California didn't really reach out to us very much. I mean, they didn't want to hear the story. It's a bad news story, right? But I don't think they fully understood the risk that they were carrying. And I think over the last couple of years that has increased dramatically. In fact, yeah, you probably don't follow CalPERS board elections like we do, or I do. But
come on, who doesn't follow CalPERS board elections in this crowd?
But just recently, the president of the CalPERS board was removed and replaced by a local police officer from Corona, I believe. And I think the part of the message there that he had was that CalPERS needs to be doing a better job at maximizing investment returns, because he thinks those folks at the local level understand that they have some risk. Can I just highlight
Please.
one other thing? So one other issue is that, and I didn't quite get to it in the numbers here, but actually I'll start a question for anyone. How much has the S&P 500 increased since 2010, roughly, percentage-wise? Does anyone want to take a guess? S&P 500. It's 140%. 140%. What's happened to the obligations, the debt load, if you will, for cities and counties and special districts out there? They are in the most pain that they've been in history. Yet we just had this huge run-up in the S&P 500. I mean, most people are saying this is great, the stock market is on fire. But they don't feel it at the local level. In fact, if you look at, I said that the average increase in contributions was 400%. It will double again by the year 2030. So the cost that you are paying at the local level will probably double. So we're only halfway through the pain. So even though we've had this wonderfully positive economic story in terms of assets, in theory, we're not really in a better place. We're in a worse place today. And I know there was discussion this morning about, not so much if there's a recession coming, but sort of when the recession hits. Man, when the recession hits, it's going to be doubly painful, because not only will these systems see their assets decline dramatically, but they'll also see the cost increase, and there's just not much place for them to go. I mean, I wish it were a better story, but it's not a very good story.
Something I keep reciting that old Jack Nicholson line in a movie that wasn't very well watched. At the end, when he says, the biggest problem is this may be as good as it gets.
It's called As Good As It Gets.
Yes.
That movie, yeah.
That is the problem with this challenge we have. We're going to have a recession, and this is going to be a very painful time.
Yeah, California, school districts and local governments have never been this poorly financed at this stage in the cycle. We're in the 9th year of a bull market. We've had a 30% tax increase. And just to put it in perspective, I live in San Francisco. The San Francisco Unified School District, which has 55,000 children in it, school children in it, this year is able to devote only 29% of its budget to salaries for certificated teachers, because spending on pensions and retiree health care, which is big there, went up 106% in the last 5 years, and you ain't seen nothing yet. And so it's a very dangerous situation. It's also probably the most difficult political problem to solve. Would you not? I mean, how many
bruises.
people in the United States can you point to as having successfully addressed retirement finance problems at state and local governments?
Yeah.
On one hand, Sam Liccardo and Chuck Reed, Gina Raimondo in Rhode Island, John Hickenlooper, Colorado's done a little bit.
Eric Filseth.
No, we haven't done it. All we've done is gauge the problem so far.
Their approach is incredibly clever to properly account for this because, you know, I just want to also point out, employees didn't cause this problem. Everybody likes to give the employees. There's not anybody we know who doesn't seek the highest compensation in general, whether it's somebody working for a pharmaceutical company or a Wall Street firm or a policeman who wants to get the highest compensation and the highest benefits. The problem is caused by elected officials giving them that, which still isn't a problem if you properly finance it. There are plenty of defined benefit plans in the world that work beautifully. Ontario Teachers plan works beautifully. Berkshire Hathaway is a $15 billion liability. It works perfectly. Why? Because they are honest about funding it at a truthful discount rate and a truthful investment return assumption. This problem is caused largely by underfunding caused by lying elected officials and pension fund board members, not by the employees. You can't blame them for doing it.
Well, I mean, I actually have a little bit of optimism about this, which is, you know, I have come to believe that, you know, the taproot of all evil is the distortion in the discount rate, okay? Because that's the thing that allows the illusion that we're all balancing our budgets. Because our revenue and expenses, every city in California is like that. I mean, our constituents want to see our budget balanced. And so, you know, we show them a budget that's balanced every year, even though we have small operating losses, which add up to large amounts of debt, right? But if you got rid of that, and if it were transparent and you had to record that, I believe that the normal processes of government would tend to push people in the right direction. Now, you guys had a huge problem to clean up, right?
I mean,
So forth, and our goal is, you know, not to have to be in the position that you folks found yourself, right? And so, if we steer the bus a little bit differently now, hopefully we'll be able to avoid a lot of that pain in the future.
well, it's all about power. Some of the people in the audience know this. Joe certainly does. I was removed from the board of the California State Teachers Retirement System in 2005, 2006, because I said you're lying about the discount rate. We're understating our liabilities by half, which was $200 billion. And we're overstating the investment return, which they were using 8% then. And I said, but we'll be fine if we assume a 6.2% investment return assumption and we fully fund at that rate. And had they done that, by the way, they would not have a deficit at CalSTRS in school districts in California. But their response was to kick me off the board because the state Senate and under the pressure of government employee unions don't want governments to have to record the true cost of these obligations. So it is that, but politically, where can you get it done? So who's going to follow Palo Alto?
But that's the thing. I mean, so many government innovations don't come from Washington, D.C. or even Sacramento. They start at the municipal level. And if you can
Who's
get
gonna
sort
follow
of
you?
a groundswell of
You're being a
all you
pony.
guys, right?
There is a challenge, though. I mean, running as a Democrat in a blue state, in my case, running for mayor when unions are spending more than $1 million against you, precisely because of your position on this issue, I can tell you this is perilous territory.
Yeah.
And so, you know, there needs to be a significant, reevaluation, I think, of the Democratic Party. If we're going to stand up for government, and because we believe in government as a party, we got to find candidates who are actually willing to save government.
Let me comment on that for a second, too.
And then we're
this is not a
get ready for questions.
This is
We have like
not
15
a
minutes.
prescription. I mean, it helps that we're a small town. It also helps we've got a council loaded up with MBAs, which you can get all kinds of trouble when that happens, right? But one of the things that, and our labor situation is dramatically different than San Jose's, but one of the things that we were very, very careful in when we started doing this was to scrupulously avoid talking about policy while we did the actuarial analysis. Because if you start talking about policy while you're doing the math, then the math gets politicized. And so we were scrupulously careful to avoid all discussion of policy until we had sort of consensus numbers that people agreed on. And now we're just getting into the phase of talking about policy. And I think anybody that's trying this, you know, that's a minimum you have to do, and you still may not make it through.
All right. Can we open up for questions? Anybody got a question? Yes.
I wanted to go back to an issue you were touching on a little bit at the end, which is the governance of these pension boards. In most areas of government, we have some amount of transparency. If I have a local pothole and I want to complain, I can find my local council member. But I'm pretty sure there aren't like phone numbers for the boards for like CalPERS, for example, and these are people who are controlling $1 trillion fund. So do you take issue with that? To what extent do you think these members are acting in the best interest of those funds?
Well, I'll be happy to start first, having served on a state board. Proposition 162, which the voters passed in 1992, in response to an incredibly silly budget maneuver that Pete Wilson did. That proposition changed the fiduciary obligation of members of the state pension boards so that they owe their obligation to the fund and to the members of the fund. So for example, they used that argument against me when I said we will have deficits in school districts 10 years down the road unless we drop the investment return assumption. They used that against me. They said I breached my fiduciary obligation because I wasn't just paying attention to the members or the fund. And because school districts can't go broke, they're going to get their pensions no matter what. So if your goal was to try and get somebody at CalPERS or CalSTRS, if that's what you're talking about, to do what Eric's doing, right, to drop the investment return assumption, make the call, but you'll probably have next to no impact. We have to change, at Government for California, my political organization, over time, over the next 10 years, we hope that the legislature will put on the ballot a revision to Prop 162 so the fiduciary obligation is to those who actually bear the cost. I wish I could give you a better answer.
I will add that David probably has to go to the ballot because even when Jerry Brown proposed his reforms, he asked for more independence of the board. He wanted to add 2 more seats to CalPERS to have financial independence, and Labor wouldn't give it to him. So this is why we have the ballot.
If I could just add, you're right, there's a problem with transparency on the boards, but they, at least at the local level, I can say, they do pay attention to what the plan sponsor is saying. And when we're very vocal about the need to reduce discount rates, we have seen the boards respond to that vocal pressure, but we have no authority beyond appointing them. After they're appointed, they're there. So, I agree there is a real problem there, but I think there's a role for elected officials to step up.
I would just point out, in that case, the employees could suffer if San Jose goes broke. So those employees have an interest in the truthful discount rate. If they don't know it now, there are 2 questions back there.
Let me say one real briefly on that, just to be clear, is that as a local agency, I think what we've discovered is you don't have to wait for CalPERS. Okay? It's possible to put some space between your finances and CalPERS because inherently as a local agency you're going to be more conservative than CalPERS is, and that enables. Sorry, I think as a local agency you can do this without going to CalPERS. You can do this independently of CalPERS, and I think that's what people need to do.
Okay, let's go to the, you've got the microphone, you pick them.
2 questions. First of all, the state can go broke when they have less revenue than they have expenses. Doesn't matter what the statute says. If people leave, you're going to go broke. But the real question I have is on productivity. What productivity, have people given very serious thought to use of productivity tools to reduce the employee headcount so that they would have the revenue stream to pay for the present and future employee obligations?
Well, while the guys who are actually in government are answering that question, I will tell you, you can make them as productive as ever and you don't solve this problem. The math is so big, the compounding is so great, the liabilities are so massive, you can get down to negative employees and you still have a problem. As to states being able to declare bankruptcy, they cannot. There is no statute. So Congress had to give Puerto Rico the right to declare bankruptcy. And in California, you have a waterfall in the general fund. Money goes first to Prop 98, second to debt service on general obligation bonds, and pari passu with that, if not senior, is payments to retirees under pensions and retiree health care. Virtually everything else is underneath it, which is why, by the way, the share of the budget this year for the orphan programs, UC, CSU, courts, parks, and welfare, they're the ones who bear all the burden, plus taxpayers, their share is half of what it was a decade ago. So there's enormous room in the state budget to keep crowding out everything before you get to that theoretical point you're talking about revenues exceeding expenses. Not to mention, they have the power to tax. Well, we know that, and everybody can keep saying it, and they still don't. And even though the rate's at 13.3, there's still enough to keep paying it. Believe me, you don't know the state legislature if you think they won't continue to try and pass taxes.
There's no question in my mind, but at some point in time, people say enough is enough.
Oh.
15,000 leave.
Oh, really?
No, sixth generation here, I will. But there is a point at which, when you're taking 50% of my check, or you're taking 70% of my check to pay for these outrageous pension benefits, I'll say thank you very much.
Keep us posted.
Yeah, I just cite the great philosopher Yogi Berra, who said that, I don't go there anymore. Nobody goes there anymore. It's too crowded, right? That's what everyone's saying right now about the Bay Area, right? And they're saying that about California. The point is, even though in every survey the Bay Area Council does about how everyone's going to leave the Bay Area, the next year they're all still here, saying they're going to leave next year. I don't think that's our great threat, although I know it is a concern about employers, because I think clearly employers are doing more hiring outside the state increasingly as taxes rise. But in terms of the core issue about productivity, look, fundamentally, this is not a profit-making enterprise, this business of government. If it was, it'd be done by the private sector.
I would just mention the far greater threat to people leaving is people not supporting legislators. Far greater threat. All of this stuff happens. I bet you if I went around this room of highly educated people in this audience and pointed to them and said, tell me the name of your state assembly person or your state senator, the vast majority of you would not know their names. And that is why the government employee unions and corporations have gotten control over the state legislature. That's a far greater threat.
In my prior career, I was a senior pension actuary at CalPERS. So you can throw the tomatoes. So one of the things I did there was I convinced the board to go from 7.5 to 7. But the other thing was what we called a risk mitigation strategy, where we were trying to further lower the discount rate and actually adjust the asset allocation into less risky assets, because we thought that the current allocation was too risky. And that was agreed upon, and I think now it's suspended and it's kind of up in the air. And so, but my question is on that category. You guys have talked about some of the issues, but I feel like the actual asset allocation, the amount of risk being taken in these systems, compared to the maturing of the system, the demographics, I think that's a huge risk, and I'm wondering why that hasn't been discussed at all today, or what perspective you might have on that.
Yeah, it's forcing us. We have a very mature plan at the point now where we have more retirees than employees, which is a terrible situation for any plan to be in, because obviously you don't have the folks to support the plan that you need paying in. And it's just forced us to have a much more conservative investment approach, which means our returns are much worse. And that is ultimately the path, I think, for a lot of cities.
It's well known among insiders about the shortening duration of liabilities of pension funds and the maturity of those pension funds and the resulting restructuring of their portfolios. They can't handle volatility. They are not long-term investors anymore. And therefore, their returns are going to have to reflect that, which is just compounding the problem. But it's not as if, even if you could have 100% equities and you could handle all the volatility in the world, you cannot solve this problem through returns. You just can't. The math is quite simple. Because they use the discount rate equal to the investment return assumption, which every financial economist knows is nonsense. The discount rate for reporting the size of your liabilities should reflect the creditworthiness of the obligor, not what you expect to earn on your assets. But because they use the same discount rate, when you're 70% funded, that means you've got liabilities of 100 and assets of 70, and those liabilities are compounding. They are accreting at the discount rate, which is 7%. So that means they're going to go to 107 in the next year, which means your 70 have to earn 11 just to keep up. So you could have the purest portfolio in the world that doesn't, where volatility is like not an issue. It's a 100-year portfolio, and you will not catch up.
This is probably oversimplistic, but I think of CalPERS in this part of CalPERS as, it's a mutual fund manager. And every mutual fund manager thinks they're going to beat the market and all the other mutual fund managers, but they're basically a mutual fund manager. And I think CalPERS, this discussion aside, seems like a reasonable one to me. I don't think that's where the problem is. The important thing is to be realistic about what the expected returns are. Also, I'll say this, right, and I'll argue about it off stage, right? I actually think the discount rate doesn't matter, okay? But the asset return rate is critically important.
Discount rate no longer matters. It mattered a long time ago. Now it's irrelevant. Now you could drop the discount rate dramatically, and the accretion is what's going to happen anyway. So we were way past that point. This was an easy problem to solve a decade ago by doing, for example, what I suggested and many others suggested, use a reasonable investment return then. Now, you're going to have to cut benefits for years not yet worked, and you're going to have to reduce the COLA, and it's going to be like a civil war because employees who did nothing wrong are going to have to take a cut. Lenny, and then this young lady in front here.
Assume you had a group of legislators in California who understood math and were deeply committed to solving this problem. What would be at the top of your list about what they could do that is remotely plausible?
So you have to get to 41 votes in the Assembly and 21 in the Senate and the governor's signature to get anything done in California. There are 80 members of the Assembly, 40 members of the Senate, so you have to get to majorities. And we have ex-legislator like Joe Nation on the dais. He knows the way things work. We have a mayor, a city councilman. I'm not one of those, but from my experience with people in that area, it's very much of a binary decision. You don't try for something until you think you're going to win. If you try before you think you're going to win, you're going to get whacked. So pension reform is probably the last issue the state legislature will address. It is such a third rail issue. OPEB reform would be much easier for them to do. A bunch of other things would be easier for them to do. Education reform like teacher dismissal, tenure reform, maybe LIFO reform, all that kind of stuff, I believe, in the state legislature comes before pension reform. At the local level, where you probably need state help on some of the legislation, depends on after the California rule comes out. You'll have to tell me.
Yeah, I think it took a recession, the Great Recession, to really force our hand and to force it to the top of the political priority list for the rest of the community. And that was when we had a more robust media that helped to actually tell the story. I think it's so critical. I'm glad that CALmatters is on it, but we need, obviously, much more robust local media as well.
Well, this lady had her hand up first.
So with respect to retiree health care, upon first hearing about it, it would appear to me that discontinuing or reducing that program would end up putting more burden on Medi-Cal or Medicare, different federal programs. So what would you see, in the situation that retiree health care was majorly reformed, what impacts would that have on other state level healthcare programs?
Next to nothing. So reforming retiree health care puts people take someone like me, let's say I was a government employee, I'm turning 65, I'm entitled to Medicare. If I'm being subsidized by the city of San Francisco, which I'm not, but if I was a former employer, I would be, and they said to me, we are no longer going to subsidize you, I'd be getting my care from Medicare, which is fully funded by the federal government. There's no impact on the state. The Obamacare subsidies are eligible for, and they're paid for by the federal government for people up to 400% of the poverty level, and again, that's before they turn 65. So there's no impact on the state. I mean, it's the most nonsensical thing in the world that governments in California are diverting money from existing employee salaries and other services to subsidize people who get their care from Medicare.
Good, yeah.
I'm curious, especially the perspective in Sacramento, so maybe Judy, you'd have some perspective on this. We're talking about the health of the California budget and these liabilities. Does this issue fall or tend to fall along party lines or stereotypical party lines, or do you see that this issue defies party lines? And what's your perspective on that?
Yes and no, right? Because right here, here's a Democratic mayor, and here's a former Democratic lawmaker. They know math. And yet, so they're acknowledging the problem. But in Sacramento, when you're in office, you're getting your you're filling your coffers from labor. And so you are given the signal from labor whether or not you can go ahead and do something. When I was reporting my story about pension reform, the head of Warren Furutani, he was the head of the pension committee, very much said to me, "Oh yeah, I got the go-ahead signal from labor, so I was told by labor, yes, I can do some reform." So it was that explicit. So I think the better question would be how much control labor has in Sacramento, and they have immense power and still do. And so what I'm watching for, and I think what people here will be watching for, is how much control they have with a Newsom administration. Who he puts in, who he appoints, and the next batch, and the lawmakers who are there in the Capitol now. That's to be seen.
Can I just emphasize how much power labor has on Democrats there? So two quick stories. So in 2003, I decided I was going to make a run for speaker in the assembly. And one of the things I did was go around and talk to folks from the third house, lobbyists. And I went to talk to the head of the California Teachers Association. And I said, I know we haven't always agreed. Gross understatement, I was the Charter School Legislator of the Year. But I said, but no one will be better on issues that are really important to you than me. And I'd like to be able to work with you to become speaker. And he just laughed. He said, you will never be speaker. And I said, well, how's that? And he said, I won't let you. And I said, well, John, I didn't know you had a vote. And he said, I run this place. And so, and that is not an atypical conversation. And what's sad about it is it's true. If you were a Democrat there, I mean, Sam said that he had, you got whacked by $1 million worth of labor, public employee labor ads coming after you in your election. I went through the same thing, and when I ran for the state senate, the difference is I lost. But it is very tough because Democrats run both houses and control the governor's, mansion, if you will. It's really tough to do it. You have Republicans who are trying to move things in the right direction. You have Democrats who, David and I had dinner with a couple of state senators recently, and they both said, yeah, we know this is a really big problem. We're not sure how to solve it yet. So the awareness is increasing, but there will have to be some sort of a signal from labor. And I think in the end, it's going to have to be those, I hope, those beneficiaries from the local level, cities and counties and special districts who say, we are going to get whacked. We're going to lose our benefits. We need you to step in and do something that helps save us. That's my hope.
Joe gets the last word. We want to thank you for joining us today and thank our panelists for their great presentations.